The story of J.P. Morgan, a man with an enormous fortune and unparalleled power, has always captured the public's attention. He was the founder of the first company valued at over $1 billion, controlling some of the most lucrative industries in the United States and having the ability to shape the fate of the entire US economy. Every decision he made, whether a casual remark or a quick signature, carried enough weight to shake entire industries. Whether admired or criticized, J.P. Morgan remains a unique figure with undeniable influence. In this video, we will explore the fascinating story of his life. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 in Connecticut, USA, into a wealthy and powerful family. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a successful banker who had high hopes for his son to follow in his footsteps. He provided John with the best education money could buy. However, John's childhood was far from the ideal life one might imagine. The young boy was frail, often suffering from severe coughing fits, migraines, seizures, and a range of other illnesses such as scarlet fever. As a result, John couldn't enjoy outdoor play like other children and instead spent much of his time indoors, studying and delving into financial reports. On one occasion, when John contracted rheumatic fever, his father decided to send him to live alone on the Azores Islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, hoping that the mild climate and salty air would help his son recover. John spent nearly a year on the islands without the company of his family. Once his health improved, he continued his studies in Boston, Switzerland, and Germany. In 1857, at the age of 19, after completing his education, John began his professional journey with the support of his father, who was a partner at George Peabody and Company in London. John's job was to manage the company's interests in America, a rapidly growing market at the time. His primary responsibility was to write reports on the financial and political situation in the United States and send them to his father's company. Despite being highly intelligent and talented, John's father was often concerned about his son's impulsive and quick-tempered nature, believing these traits might hinder his success in finance. He consistently emphasized that John needed to learn to control his emotions and develop a sense of responsibility. A clear example of this occurred in 1859 when John took a risky step by using the company's money to purchase an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee that had just arrived at the port without confirming whether there were buyers. Although the deal ultimately brought in significant profits, the bank's leadership, including John's father, was not pleased with the risky approach. In 1861, at the age of 24, John decided to leave his father's company to build his own career. He established his own firm and continued to act as an agent for his father's bank in England. That same year, John married his first love, Amelia Sturgis. This brief period of his life was likely the happiest, but that happiness was tragically short-lived. Amelia soon developed a persistent cough and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. In an attempt to recreate the healing experience he had once had, John took Amelia on a long honeymoon to the Mediterranean, hoping the climate would help her recover. Sadly, all efforts proved futile, and just 2 months after their wedding, Amelia passed away, leaving John a widower at the age of 24. The immense grief of losing her left John devastated and emotionally broken. The story of J.P. Morgan is not just a journey from humble beginnings to the pinnacle of financial power and influence, but also a deeply personal tragedy that highlights the challenges he faced in both his professional and personal life. It offers a unique glimpse into the life of one of the most powerful men in the history of global finance. It is believed that John Pierpont Morgan never truly overcame the grief of losing his wife. After her death, he immersed himself in work more than ever before. While John was grappling with this personal tragedy, the United States was also entering a tumultuous period in its history. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, was at its peak in 1863, and the implementation of the Military Draft Act required men like John to enlist. However, John opted to pay $300 to avoid military service and hired a substitute. This decision did not mean he was disconnected from the war, however. In fact, he profited considerably from it. One notable example was his involvement in a deal to purchase 5,000 surplus muskets from the government at just $3.50 each. These rifles, which had become outdated, were then refurbished by the purchasing company and sold back to the government for $22 each, over 6 times the original price, earning John a substantial profit. While profiting from the war certainly did not endear him to the public or the government, John seemed unbothered by the criticism, and he was soon to face even bigger controversies. The railroad tycoon era. In 1871, John saw a promising opportunity for collaboration with Anthony Drexel, one of the country's top financiers. Together, they founded a private commercial bank, Drexel, Morgan and Company, the precursor to what would become J.P. Morgan and Company, the bank John would lead for the rest of his life, and this bank became the foundation for the enormous financial empire that would eventually evolve into J.P. Morgan Chase, the banking giant we know today. In the early stages of his career, John mostly served as an intermediary, connecting wealthy investors to potential projects in exchange for a share of the profits. As his wealth and reputation grew, he began to finance projects himself, with one of his first major investments being in the U.S. railroad system. At the time, most other major industries were dominated by a single tycoon, Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller in oil, but the railroad industry was different. Rather than being monopolized, it was fragmented, with numerous competing companies operating on the same routes, often forced to cut prices to attract customers. While most people saw this cutthroat competition as chaotic, John saw opportunity. He believed the solution lay in consolidation, merging competing railroads rather than allowing them to fight one another. John understood that the larger the business, the greater the economies of scale. His goal was to transform many small companies into a single, unified corporation. By doing so, rather than undercutting prices to outcompete one another, the companies could freely set their own rates by controlling the entire railway network in a given region. John began aggressively investing in various railroads, systematically taking over financially struggling companies, streamlining their management and merging them into larger entities. He would then acquire any remaining competitors, creating a dominant monopoly in the process. This strategy, known as the Morganization process, proved so effective that it became synonymous with his name. What set John apart from other businessmen and investors of his time was his active involvement in the management of the companies he invested in. He was not content with simply purchasing stocks and waiting for profits to roll in. He sought power and control, desiring to directly influence the operations of the businesses he invested in. This hands-on approach, along with his strategic vision for consolidation, played a pivotal role in shaping both his fortune and the American economy during his lifetime. John wanted to command directly, so he frequently used his influence in the boardrooms to steer companies according to his will. He often reorganized the leadership of various railroad companies and merged them into monopoly conglomerates, always under his leadership. When railroad companies came to him for help, John would refuse unless he was given full control. This not only granted him the power he craved, but also helped stabilize the industry, which in turn attracted more European investment into American railroads. As the industry became more unified and stable, thanks to John's efforts, his wealth continued to grow. John went on to buy more and more railroad lines, always striving to surpass his previous achievements, becoming more ambitious with each deal. For example, he purchased 250,000 shares from financier William Vanderbilt in one of America's most famous railroads, the New York Central Railroad. A year later, he went even further by facilitating a massive bond deal for the railroad, helping to complete the Northern Pacific Railway with a $40 million investment. After this deal, John's influence in the railroad industry reached its peak, controlling 1/3 of all the railroads in the United States, a staggering figure considering that 60% of the market value of the stock market at the time was tied to railroad companies. John didn't just invest, he was deeply involved in restructuring and merging companies, solidifying his dominant position and growing his immense fortune. However, beneath the dazzling success, John harbored a deep insecurity about his appearance. He suffered from a condition called rosacea, a skin inflammation that caused the blood vessels in his nose to swell and rupture, making it constantly red. On top of that, he had rhinophyma, which made his nose even larger and bumpy. His self-consciousness about his appearance led him to avoid cameras, and whenever a portrait was painted, he requested the artist to adjust the nose to hide the flaw. Despite this, his distinct features, combined with his tall stature and commanding voice, projected an air of authority that inspired both awe and fear in those around him. In 1901, however, John encountered a rival of equal stature, President Theodore Roosevelt. Previously, thanks to his close relationship with President William McKinley, John had successfully merged the Northern Pacific Railroad with two other railroads, creating the massive Northern Securities Corporation. But after McKinley's assassination, Roosevelt took office and immediately made his position clear regarding monopolies. Roosevelt directed the Justice Department to sue John's company for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Despite John's strong opposition, Northern Securities was ultimately forced to dissolve, marking the beginning of a tense showdown between the two most powerful men in America. When news broke that Roosevelt was preparing for a trip to Africa, John made a pointed remark saying, "I hope the first lion he meets will do its duty." For someone like John, this was just a minor obstacle in his pursuit of dominance. He had an even bolder plan in mind, one deal that would shake the entire country: steel industry takeover. The birth of U.S. Steel. By 1901, Carnegie Steel was at the peak of its dominance, controlling the steel industry and being one of the most valuable companies in the United States. Although it was generating $40 million in revenue annually, Andrew Carnegie, the founder, was ready to retire and sell his empire. But who had the financial strength to buy such a powerful company? Enter J.P. Morgan. At the right moment, John offered Carnegie a deal. Carnegie was asked to set the price, and he set it at a record-breaking $480 million, an unprecedented figure in business history. Without hesitation, John agreed, even declaring he would pay an additional $100 million if necessary. This historic deal was finalized in 1901, but it was just the beginning of John's grand plan. He merged Carnegie Steel with Federal Steel Company and other businesses to form U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. With a market capitalization of $1.4 billion, it represented about 1/6 of the total market value of all manufacturing industries in the United States at the time, which amounted to around $9 billion. And this deal allowed John to control approximately 2/3 of the steel production in America. Steel and railroads were the two backbone industries of the economy, and with U.S. Steel, John seemed to hold both of them firmly in his grasp. By controlling these essential sectors, John Morgan cemented his place as one of the most powerful men in history, shaping the U.S. economy for decades to come. But John's ambitions didn't stop there. He also financed Thomas Edison's early electrical experiments and played a pivotal role in the merger of Edison Electric with its competitors, creating General Electric. Moreover, John's influence extended further, helping to shape what would later become AT&T, one of the largest telecommunications conglomerates in the world. John's genius for merging companies and building powerful business empires is unquestionable. However, an economic storm was silently brewing, one that would soon strike the U.S. and threaten to undo everything he had built. The 1893 economic crisis. In 1893, the United States plunged into an unprecedented economic depression. After decades of continuous growth and a wave of speculative investment, the economic bubble finally burst, throwing the economy into chaos. Stock prices plummeted by nearly half. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt. Hundreds of banks closed, and unemployment rates skyrocketed. This crisis instilled fear among foreign investors who rushed to exchange their U.S. government bond for gold, draining the country's gold reserves. At that time, the U.S. dollar was still on the gold standard, meaning anyone holding U.S. dollars could exchange them for gold. This system bolstered confidence in the value of the dollar, and the U.S. government maintained a minimum of $100 million in gold reserves to back it. But by 1895, most of this gold had been withdrawn, and the value of the dollar sharply declined. At its worst, the government's gold reserves were reduced to just over $9 million, pushing the U.S. to the brink of default. The scramble for gold exacerbated the panic, creating a domino effect as more and more investors withdrew their funds, further depleting the gold reserves. Ultimately, at the time, the U.S. lacked a central bank to intervene, and the situation became dire. J.P. Morgan, to the rescue President Grover Cleveland, stood at a historic crossroads, a moment that could shape the future of the nation. Traditional methods such as issuing more bonds to the public could no longer address the urgent crisis. Recognizing the severity of the situation, John Pierpont Morgan came forward with a bold plan to save the economy. His plan centered on creating a private organization made up of the most prominent bankers in the country, working together with foreign investors to bolster the nation's gold reserves. Specifically, the organization proposed to purchase $65 million in 30-year gold bonds using 3.5 million ounces of gold. Thanks to a leftover provision from the Civil War era, President Cleveland could approve the deal immediately without congressional approval. As soon as the president signed the agreement, John telegraphed his associates in New York, and within just 22 minutes, the entire bond issuance was purchased. This decisive action quickly calmed the financial markets and restored confidence in the economy. Not only did this save the U.S. economy, but John also profited massively from the preferential interest rates on the gold bonds. However, his actions raised suspicions among the public. Was he acting out of patriotism, or was this just an opportunity to enrich himself? The relationship between large banks and the government became a major point of contention during the next election. Thanks to substantial contributions from John and his associates, the Republican candidate won, helping John maintain his close ties with the government. The 1907 financial panic. But this was not the only time John played a critical role in stabilizing the US economy. In 1907, another financial panic emerged, pushing many banks to the brink of collapse. Citizens lined up outside banks to withdraw their money, and the government even had to instruct bank tellers to count money slowly to reduce the speed of withdrawals in order to prevent a full-scale disaster. By this time, Theodore Roosevelt was president, and despite their ideological differences, both Roosevelt and John recognized the need for collaboration between the government and major businesses to resolve the crisis. Once again, John used his financial power to step in and solve the problem. He called an urgent meeting at his private library on Madison Avenue, gathering some of the most influential financial figures in the country, including the leaders of the largest banks and trusts. The goal was to discuss and devise a solution to the financial crisis. John planned to invest in struggling banks, including his competitors, understanding that some would inevitably fail, but others could be saved. After a long night of negotiation, John and his associates decided to inject massive amounts of capital into these struggling banks, providing the liquidity necessary to prevent a chain reaction of bankruptcies. Once the plan was finalized, John locked the doors of his library, demanding that all the bankers stay and continue discussing until an agreement was reached. By the morning, all the bankers had agreed to the plan, which was further supported by President Roosevelt, who authorized a contribution of $25 million from the US Treasury. The success of this plan helped restore liquidity to the economy, gradually rebuilding public confidence in the banking system. Despite John's declining health, he was 70 years old and suffering from a cold. He remained fully involved in directing the operation, ensuring the financial rescue was carried out effectively. Growing public scrutiny. However, this victory also stirred growing concern in the public. While John was hailed as a hero, many worried about the overwhelming reliance on one individual to manage the nation's economy. This fear of concentrated power led to calls for systemic change. The public became increasingly uneasy about the influence of a small group of wealthy businessmen over the entire economy. John was summoned to testify before the Pujo Committee, a body set up to investigate the true scale of the financial trusts on Wall Street and their impact on the US economy. During the hearings, John became the center of attention as the embodiment of the power of Wall Street's financial elite. Although his financial career reached its pinnacle, John's mental health began to deteriorate. He suffered from nervous breakdowns and struggled to cope with the negative press coverage. One notable event during this period was that John had originally booked a ticket for the Titanic, but ultimately canceled the trip due to health issues. The investigation into his business practices, coupled with his declining health, marked the beginning of the end of his era. The birth of the Federal Reserve. The Pujo Committee's investigation highlighted the unsustainable nature of relying on a few wealthy individuals to manage the economy, leading to the eventual establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Unfortunately, John did not live to see these changes. He passed away on March 31st, 1913, at the age of 75 while on vacation in Rome. After his death, his son took over the family business and continued to expand the financial empire. Today, J.P. Morgan Chase remains one of the largest banks in the world, having gone through numerous mergers and acquisitions. Its scale and power reflect the enduring legacy of John Pierpont Morgan. Though his influence continues to be a subject of debate, his strategic mergers and acquisitions, a hallmark of his career, laid the foundation for the vast financial empire that continues to thrive today. JP Morgan Chase's total assets now exceed $3 trillion, and the bank remains a dominant force in global finance, a testament to the enduring impact of the business empire John Morgan built. While views on his legacy may differ, it is impossible to deny the immense influence and lasting legacy of John Pierpont Morgan.